listener production.
March 1986, on a quiet Thursday afternoon in Melbourne, a massive explosion erupted outside the police station in Russell Street.
There was a red flash, the room filled with smoke. I was blown off my chair to the other side of the room, and then every other window and door started caving in around me.
One person died and 21 were injured.
But it was like time stood still.
The initial explosion came from a car parked outside the police station, which had been loaded with 50 to 60 sticks of gelignite. The first blast set off a series of petrol tank explosions in nearby cars.
I hate thunderstorms still to this day.
Debra Richardson is CEO of Police Veterans Victoria, an organisation devoted to helping police transition from the force to life outside of the job. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives. Back in 1986, Deb was a 21-year-old constable working at Russell Street Station on that Thursday, the day of the attack.
I used to say it was the day that Melbourne actually lost its innocence. We'd never experienced an incident like this in the history of our policing. In fact, very rarely across the country. I think there'd only been one other bomb that might have happened. I was working on a 1 o'clock shift. Ordinarily, on a 1 o'clock shift, I would get in late and actually walk through what was known as the south door entrance of the Russell Street Police Building. There was a main door and then there was a south door entrance. So normally I would get in at 1 o'clock and sit down at my desk in the district training office, which was right beside a window. That particular day, it was the Thursday before Easter, on the 27th of March 1986, and for some reason I came in early, and I actually entered through the back of the building, which I'd never done before, Brent, and I often wonder why I'd actually done that. But anyway, nevertheless, I came in through the back door and sat down at my desk and just started work. At 1:01, the bomb blast blew. So there had been a vehicle that had been stolen by some crooks who'd filled it with gelignite that they'd received out of a plenty quarry somewhere in Melbourne. And they had actually tried to get the police car into the back of Russell Street. There was a little police car park that was housed between the old building and the new building, and the new building housed our D24 Communications Centre. We didn't always have a guard on duty, and they tried to park the car in that little police car park, and we did have a guard on duty that day, and they said to them, "You can't park here." So they drove around outside and they parked it right in front of the south door entrance. So sitting at my desk, 1:01, the bomb blast blew. To this day, I recall time stood still. There was a red flash, one window popped, the room filled with smoke. I was blown off my chair to the other side of the room against a wall, and then every other window and door started caving in around me. And I remember in that split second actually looking down at my body going, I've been shot. Like, where's the blood? And I couldn't see any blood on me. And I'm like, what the hell was that? And I picked myself up and ran out into the corridor, was met by my sergeant, and he goes, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm okay, boss." And then there was another 5 explosions that happened between the time of the first blast and before we actually got outside and were evacuated. We found out later there was that concertina effect because the blast was so big. It was other vehicles, petrol tanks that were exploding. And so there was a delay in those explosions. So I think it was about the second or third explosion that we heard that it dawned on us then that that was a bomb. And so we started to run up and down the corridor. And I remember walking into every room, like yelling out, is everyone okay? And trying to make sure that we could help evacuate people. At that stage, Brent, I didn't even know I'd been injured. You have this adrenaline running through your body. And so by the fifth explosion, we had gathered outside and we went back through that little courtyard where the car was supposed to be parked and got out into what was called Mackenzie Street, a little street off Russell Street. And I'll never forget, there was like 300 or 400 coppers standing around who had been trained to be a police person going, what just happened to us? And this disbelief of not knowing what to do, not knowing where to go, starting to see people that were injured. There was also a lot of rumours going on too, I recall, Brent. Many people had started to say, oh God, it was a bomb and there's this many people being killed and there's all these people injured, and they were just rumours. We didn't have mobile phones in those days. So we were all standing around, and I can't recall how long we were standing around, but it felt like it was a significant amount of time. And I've never been so grateful in all my life. The Special Operations Group, nicknamed the Sons of God, and that day I think they earned their moniker, coming down from the IOOF building in Mackenzie Street in formation in their black overalls, all of a sudden took control of the scene and gave us a direction and were like, you go here and you go there and block off this intersection, you stand there. And so I ended up on an intersection about a block away from where we were, blocking it off because we were stopping all forms of traffic. I actually recall getting flyers. Someone very quickly had produced some flyers of some people that we needed to keep a lookout for. It might have been them. And so all of this was coming down to us. And I worked on that intersection. I left my point at one stage because I realised there was a radio station that were actually in Mackenzie Street. And I thought, what was my fiancé at the time is going to be absolutely frantic as well as my parents. And so I ran into the radio station and asked if I could use their phone. And I recall ringing Brighton Police Station, which was where my fiancé was working. And he happened to answer the phone and just went, hello, just like this enormous hello. I said, it's me, I'm okay. And he goes, oh, I'm coming in. And I said, you won't get anywhere near the city. The city is completely blocked off. We're in lockdown. There's no chance of you getting in. And I said, will you ring mum and dad and let them know I'm okay? And I'll ring you as soon as I can. And so I went back to my point and I worked about 8 hours and I couldn't stand any longer. And I was leaning up against a brick wall and this inspector drove past me and he wound down his window and he said, what the bloody hell are you doing, policewoman? And I said, boss, I was there. And he goes, Jesus Christ, like get in the car, and bundled me up in the car. And he said, where do you live? And I said, in Box Hill. And so he drove me out to Box Hill Hospital. They didn't even know a bomb had gone off. This was the lack of our communication in those days. And so I was dragged into the emergency department and essentially without an x-ray, without any kind of testing done on myself, they told me to go home. They put me in a wheelchair. And so the next time my mum and dad and my fiancé saw me was many hours later and I was in a wheelchair.
You've got 300 police trained to all different varying degrees to attend all different sorts of jobs, standing outside of the Russell Street building in the CBD, almost in a state of shock, undoubtedly. Everyone looking at each other, I suppose, the higher up the rank they were, the more people are looking at them going, well, what do we do? What are we supposed to do with this? There's no plan. Those police, if they were sent to a shooting or they were sent to a live job, it's like, well, you just follow what you're trained to do. But
that's right.
There was none of that, was there? It was a different time.
There definitely was none of that. And I mean, I've even heard accounts of it. Our D24 Communications Centre, all of those operators were under their desks still trying to keep up the communication because their windows had blasted in as well. I was told when I returned to work, Brent, that had the vehicle that the crooks had stolen actually got into that little police car park, there's no doubt in the eyes of our bomb experts that both of those buildings would have come down. And so there were so many little things of those days, including myself, where there should have been worse outcomes than what there actually was.
So often there's these little quirks of fate and they can work one way or the other, can't they? Where here, had there not been that static guard there, or if he'd gone off for a coffee or something, they drive in. I mean, tragically, of course, there was one fatality and dozens of people injured in this case. but so easily those numbers could have been tenfold, couldn't they?
Yeah, Brent, I didn't realise until I came back to work, which was when I dragged myself out of bed about the 8th or 9th day after the bomb and said to my parents, if I didn't get out of bed that day, I was never going to get out of bed. And in some ways, I recall walking back into that building that day was almost worse than the day of the bomb, because the day of the bomb, you're not expecting it. So, it just happens and you have to respond accordingly. And I recall parking my car, which had been locked down for the week because it was still a crime scene, so I couldn't even get to it. And just walking past every vehicle with this sense of fear and looking in it, not that I would have seen anything anyway, because the explosives were packed into the boot of the vehicle that they were in. But that fear of walking back into those doors, knowing I needed to do it, but at the same time not wanting to do it. My dad was actually saying to me, he goes, that's it. You're not going back to work. You need to stay home. Forget it. Leave them. I don't want you in the police force anymore. And it wasn't until I got back into my office, the bomb experts were actually still in my office. And as I've walked in the door, they looked at me and they said, gee, you were really lucky, Deb. And I went, yeah, I know I was lucky. And they went, no, you were really lucky. And I said, what do you mean? And somebody had put a piece of board against my window that had actually saved my life. We don't know who that was. We don't know why it was there. There was no building works going on in the lead up to that day. And they said, had that board not been there, I would have been cut to shreds. It's interesting, Brent, when they talk about the number of people that were actually injured in the bomb, they've got the significant injuries. I was never on that list. So there were many people like me that actually had suffered not only physical injuries, but also the mental injuries that never appeared on a list of injured people as a result of that bomb. So I'm sure there's hundreds more.
And we talk, don't we now, of post-traumatic stress. PTSD is a term that we are, as a society, far more familiar with. I was in the police in the 80s, as were you. That term didn't exist. It's a really interesting observation that they quote a number of 27 police injured.
That's right.
They were the ones that had the cuts and a bit of blood and things such as that. But there's probably 300 with all sorts of varying degrees of mental trauma as a result of that.
Absolutely, Brent. I was always grateful, and I don't say this critically. I met our new chief the other day and I had the same conversation with him because someone explained to him that I'd been in the Russell Street bomb. And I said to him, the police doctor came and visited me the day that I returned to work. So someone had told him I'd been there and I'd come back to work. And I recall him standing in my doorway. I was sitting at my desk. So it was a distance of, a few metres away. And he looked at me and he said, I understand you were there, policewoman. And I said, yes, boss. And he shook his head like this. And he was saying to me, you don't need to see me, do you? And I said, no, sir, I don't. And that was the extent of the help that I was given. Because that's just what, and that's what I say, I'm not being critical. We didn't know about the mental illnesses. We didn't understand them. We didn't have a label for them. We certainly didn't know how to treat them. And it was dust yourself off. You've come back to work. You'll be okay. Just keep going. It's that invisible illness that you don't realise that you have until a period of time later.
I mean, we're talking close to 40 years ago, but you would have a memory of that is as clear as if it happened yesterday, I would imagine. Was it the light first, then noise, or noise, then light? Did you lose consciousness at all during that time, or do you not know?
I have no idea, Brent. I actually have no idea. It was the red flash. It was the room filled with smoke. I was blown off my chair to the other side of the room. Every door and window started caving in around me, and that's how I recall it vividly. I actually can't even tell you that I recall the noise. I recall everything else, but it was like time stood still. And so you had those vivid memories of it happening in an order that it happened in. But I can certainly say now, my PTSD, I hate thunderstorms still to this day. If a car backfires in front of me, I'll have a heart race and, sweaty palms for a little while. And I know that has to have been because of the noise, that I just don't recall the noise at the time.
Did you have injuries to you, like any injuries that you started to discover over the days following the explosion?
Yeah, I had some spinal injuries. To this day, my back will sometimes just go on me for no reason when it's had enough. I recall about a year after the bomb, by this stage I was working out in country area. and we went to a siege, and I had to wear one of our ballistic vests for 9 hours at this siege. The next day, I couldn't even get in my vehicle because my back was so badly injured that I had to actually sit on hands and knees in the back of a car while a friend drove me out to a physiotherapist, and I crawled in there because the weight and the pressure of wearing that ballistic vest, as a result of the spinal injuries, I had scar tissue and all sorts of things build up on my back over the years because I didn't have treatment. And the treatment for your back was actually to stop and to rest. And we know now that treating a back injury in that way is not the way you should do it.
Here we are 40 years on. What are the effects of having lived through something like that?
It's definitely, as I spoke about, the loud, sudden noises that happen in front of me that I experience that physical reaction to. As hard as I try to actually understand what that is, you still can't stop that physical reaction to your body when that sudden noise happens. My family know if they're building something or doing something around the home that there's going to be a noise, they'll go, "There's a noise coming." And so they'll let me know to expect it. I will say also, though, Brent, I feel like in some ways, and this is going to sound so crazy, in some ways I feel very blessed that I had this experience because I think it's taught me so much about myself, and it's given me this resilience on life and also a gratitude that I'm here. And so you live your life differently after experiencing something like that. You have a joy in the moment. You recall that times are often worse for someone else than yourself. In 2023, I went to Ukraine. I had looked after a little foster boy when I was in the police force at the age of 11 that came out here. And long story short, I went on a humanitarian mission to Ukraine, delivering 15,000 teddy bears that we'd made to my foster son, who's now a policeman in Ukraine. And I had to do an awful lot of work on my mental health before I went, knowing that I was going to potentially put myself back into a bomb experience. I spoke to humanitarian nurses. I spoke to my nephew, who's a captain in the Australian Army, about what to expect. So I did a lot of work. But I can honestly say that experience also changed me, but also finally made me heal and realise that my experience was one experience that's affected my life forever, but I'm only potentially ever going to go through one. Whereas the people of Ukraine and all of those other countries around the world that are in a war zone and in bombings day after day after day. And so I feel like I finally came home healed from my experience after doing that mission.
It's really interesting. And also, I guess it's worthy of mention, Deb, that you lost a colleague that day to the Russell Street bombing, and it would be improper not to mention her as well. Did you know her personally at all?
I certainly knew of Angie Taylor. Her squad came into the academy the day that we graduated. They brought them in early to come and watch our graduation. And you can't have been a policewoman in those days to not know who Angie Taylor was, because she was dux of her squad. So whilst we had 2% of women in our days, and I had struggled through the academy, very gratefully graduated. I think I came second last first time around. Angie had come dux. And so every policewoman knew who Angie was because she was someone to look up to that had really achieved some incredible things. And yes, it was very, very difficult to lose someone. Angie would have gone on to do the most incredible things within the police force, but she also had an impact on so many of us in those days anyway. So she was one that we looked up to.
She was actually not in the building. She was crossing the road, I think, to go and get some lunch.
She was, Brent, and the story came out that she was working in the City Watch House, which was in the building across the road, right next to the courts, the magistrates' courts. And at lunchtime every day, they would toss a coin to see who was going to come across to our mess room and buy the lunches. And Angie tossed the coin and lost the toss. She was walking across. She was in the middle of the road with the magistrate and another policeman. Ian West was the magistrate and Carl Donadio was the policeman. And the three of them got to the middle of the road, and the boys decided to wait for the traffic because there was some cars coming. And Angie ran across in front of some cars and unfortunately experienced the full force of the bomb. and returned back to the magistrate's court. It took her some time to pass away. And I understand every time she woke up through those few days before we did lose her, she would apologise for causing such a fuss to her nurses. And, you know, that was the type of person she was, an incredible lady.
And Deb, some of the listeners may be going, well, how could Deb know all these other female officers? Well, because there's only about 3 or 4 of them. You said there was about 2% that went through your wing, and that was about par for the course. So all of these young women, they were 18, 19, 20
That's
at the time of graduation. They all knew each other. And so, you know, so you've lost, you know, one of your sisters, if you like, who has gone through the same experiences as you at a very, very tough time to be a policewoman. I mean, it's tough being a policewoman per se, but during that time there was all additional sort of barriers and restrictions and all sorts of things going on for women in the job, weren't there?
There was. It was hard. You know, we had to feel like we had to prove ourselves harder than what the boys were doing. And, you know, and I recall going out to my first station, Brent, and of course I was the first policewoman that had ever appeared there. And I remember one of them saying to me, why are you even here? You're just going to be useless. What are you going to do when a brawl breaks out? You're going to put yourself in the van and you're going to lock the doors and hide away. And I still recall that conversation because you go, well, actually, no, I'm not. And you watch. I'm actually going to be right there beside you. But they didn't know how to handle us because there wasn't many of us.
It's a terrible story, the Russell Street bombing. For so many folks who listen into this, you know, your recollection of that will take them right back there to that time. And as you so poignantly said at the start of the chat, Deb, it's the day that Melbourne, Victoria lost its innocence. Coming up, Deb's new role as CEO of Police Veterans Victoria and how what happened in 1986 forms a part of how she'll support police leaving the job today. Let's fast forward to 2018. You successfully lobbied the then state government of Victoria to keep police killer Craig Minogue. Now, Craig Minogue was one of the Russell Street bombers. You successfully lobbied state government to keep him in jail. This is a story that some have probably heard of, but perhaps don't know your connection to it. Can you outline this for us?
Often over the years, Brent, Craig Minogue's name had come up in media. He would lobby every so often to, you know, get a degree, to get some special privilege in prison, all of those things. And every time he would come to the forefront of the media, I'd have this anxiety, but also this anger that, you know, God, he's in the news again. And this particular day, I was driving to work and I'd heard that he was lobbying to get out of prison and to go on parole. And I had been listening to the radio. On my way to work, I was actually working at a cemetery at the time, and walked into the office, and it had been the first time in many years that they'd actually played the D24 tapes of the day, and I hadn't heard them in a long time. Every anniversary on the 27th of March, I recall the day, and I take a quiet moment myself to reflect on those days. So most of the time, I'm prepared that there may be something in the media that the day's coming up. So I'm driving to work. I'm hearing he's lobbying to get out of prison. I was listening to the radio and all of a sudden they play the D24 tapes. By the time I got to work, I was a bit of a mess because it was actually just listening to what actually happened on the radio. And like I said earlier, we didn't have mobile phones or anything. So the thing that we had was the D24 tapes. And by the time I got into work, I had had a cry in the car. I was starting to feel really anxious. And I walked into my boss and he said, "What's the matter?" And I explained to him and I just said, "Look, I just need to take a moment." And I had a cry and I went and sat down, got a coffee and walked outside and had a bit of a walk around. And so driving home that night, I was okay. I had some people ask me what was going on throughout the course of the day and I thought I'd got control of myself. And at that stage, didn't have any intention on doing anything about it. And I'm driving home and every news station is talking about Craig Minogue's going for parole. By the time I walked in the door at home, that anxiety that I'd had and the reaction of tears initially had absolutely turned to anger. And I walked in the door and my husband said to me, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Bloody hell, like Craig Minogue's trying to get out of prison and he's trying to get parole." I walked away and said to him I was going to go and have a bath. And so I got in the bath and I had my mobile phone with me. And for the first time ever, I decided to write this massively long email to, it was actually Neil Mitchell, who was hosting 3AW, and he was the reporter that I'd heard throughout the course of the day. And when I finally got out of the bath, I went to my husband and he goes, "God, you were gone a long time." And I said, "I've just written to Neil Mitchell." And as I said that, the phone rang and it was Neil's producer. And she said, "Deborah, we've passed your email on to Neil and we've had a talk about this. And are you happy to tell your story?" Of course, my family and friends had known about my experience in the Russell Street bomb, but pretty much that was the extent of what I'd done. And that anger turned into a passion about it was finally time to tell my story publicly, because I could never let this man get out of jail. And it wasn't a legacy for me, Brent. It was a legacy for every police officer that came after me. And what had happened was there had been a law passed in Parliament that meant that if you killed a police person, you would serve life in jail. But it wasn't retrospective. So what happened was there was a loophole which technically meant that Craig Minogue was going to be able to apply for parole and get out. And so the very next morning, Neil put me on his radio station and we had an extensive call. I thought I was okay during the time, but I remember getting off the phone and actually bursting into tears again because it was the first time I had actually told this story publicly. And basically from that moment on, then his producer was in touch with me all day saying that other people wanted to have a conversation with me. Parliament was sitting that day, and I understand that the reporters were all standing around and several people heard my interview and they started saying, "We need to talk to this lady." And through the course of telling that story on the day, it was the Andrews government that were in Parliament at the time. And by the time I got onto the news that night, Daniel Andrews had stood up in Parliament and promised that he would make sure that that law was changed and it was going to be retrospective and he would not let Craig Minogue get out of prison and that he would be in prison for his life. And I feel very grateful. I feel grateful that it was my story that actually has ensured for now, forever, that if someone does kill a police officer in Victoria, that they won't be seeing outside again.
It's your voice. It's one person's voice having made that decision to speak out after, 30 years. And it's that wonderful domino effect. As you and I know, we don't have to go into the minutiae, but when criminal laws are changed, they don't tend to apply, retrospectively. So they can't, if it comes in today, that they can't be applied to actions that were taken yesterday. Be it Dan Andrews or whoever finds themselves in that position to stand up in Parliament and apply those retrospectively, that would be setting quite a precedent, I would think. And all as a result of you having that anger, that drive. This must stand out for you as one of the things that you would look back as probably one of your greatest achievements, I would think. Is that being too over the top?
No, it's not been too over the top at all. But as I said, I don't think about it for me personally. What I think about it for is that it protects all of our police officers each and every day now moving forward. And I hope that law stands forever. And it is a great legacy, and I am proud of it.
Minogue continues to do his time in prison and he will stay there in custody for the remainder of his natural life.
He will, yep.
Let's fast forward to now, 2025. In June this year, you took up the role of CEO of the Police Veterans Victoria, the PVV. Can you tell us a little bit about the PVV, your role in that and how you're enjoying that?
Absolutely. The first thing I will say is that I had made the decision early this year to leave my last organisation after 5 years. And part of that, Brent, was because I had gone to Ukraine. And coming back from Ukraine, I realised that I wanted to go and work for a not-for-profit or NGO space. And so I took the leap of faith in January this year and was sitting at home going, I don't know where I'm going to go or what I'm going to do. And this job actually came up, and all of a sudden I knew that there was nowhere else that I would rather be and that this was the job that I absolutely wanted. And so went through the process. I had been a member of PVV since they started in 2014. They were an organisation that were dedicated to helping police veterans, anyone that had served in Victoria Police. We have about 7,000 members currently. We're hoping to expand that. We are the only police veterans organisation officially across Australia that works solely on helping police veterans. And I'm hoping over time that we can get this across the whole country. And I have had several other states reach out to me once they understand the importance of the role that we play. We know from our 7,000 members that 1 in 3 of them have experienced some form of post-traumatic stress disorder or other mental illnesses. And it's not until they walk away from the job that they start to actually realise the long-term effects and that cumulative grief that have built up over those events that they've experienced time and time again. And so one of the things that we do, which is our main program, is a peer support program. So currently we have 76 peer supporters across Victoria. And if we have a veteran or a family member reach out to us to say they're struggling, they might be experiencing the effects of trauma. Every event that happens in the normal community happens to our veterans, but with the added layer of trauma over the top of it. We've helped 5 veterans that have been homeless. So there's all sorts of scenarios that they'll come to our attention, and then we will match them up with one of our peers to provide that support to them. It might be as simple as ringing them and having a chat to them once a week, once a month, taking them out for a coffee. We had a veteran recently that we looked after that came down from country Victoria because he needed to have surgery and the non-ambulance organisations weren't available. He didn't have family or friends that were capable. And so we put the call out and we had a veteran in country Victoria pick him up, bring him down for his surgery. We had another couple that went in and visited him in the hospital. And then we were there to take him home again after his surgery and check in. And I think one of the highlights for me out of that scenario, a simple scenario where we can make a difference, he actually said to us later that the biggest loss that you have when you take that uniform off, that police uniform, is that loss of identity, that loss of sense of purpose, because you've given your life to working in the police force and looking after community, and that's gone all of a sudden. And he actually said to our colleagues, I thought I lost that part of the Blue family, but all of a sudden you've made me realise that I'm back in it. And so the greatest gift that we can have is to set them up with people that understand what they've gone through and to also be there to support them and to make sure that they know. We all used to say when we've left the police force that I'm an ex-copper. There's no such thing as ex now. We call them all veterans because they deserve to have that degree of respect and acknowledgement of the service that they've done. The big job for me, Brent, right now is to understand that PVV has been set up as a charity organisation. We have zero funding that comes into us. So every single thing that we do is as a charity, as every charity, you look for donations, you fundraise, you try and get the word out there and the voice out there. But I hope that one day during my tenure that I will have the opportunity where government understands that our veterans are equally as important as what our defence veterans are. And I say that with the greatest respect, Brent, because none of us say that the defence veterans shouldn't get what they get. They absolutely, emphatically deserve that. But they have millions of dollars thrown into supporting them from the health system, from courses, from all of these things that are wrapped around them. And again, I say this with the greatest respect and hope that this stays in this way. Our defence veterans train every day, and not many of them in this day and age will go and see active combat, thankfully. But our police veterans are on the front line every single day. And more often, it's not one event that they're going to go to that they remember. It's multiple events, and sometimes that can be multiple times in a shift that they experience a traumatic event. Our veterans 100% deserve that support when they leave this job, and we should at least be able to give them help with the health system, at the very least, and acknowledging what they do and the risk that they push on themselves and their families each and every day that they go to work.
And Deb, those numbers that you mentioned, and I really like that comparison you make, because we often do hear this comparison to frontline staff, policing staff to the military. And I think those in the military would be first to admit that those within the military that tragically suffer from post-traumatic stress are going to be those in the military who have experienced active service.
Yes.
The nature of policing is different, and no one for one moment is taking anything away from the service and often the ultimate sacrifice that our Defence Force make. But
absolutely,
there would not be another employer in the country who would have statistics in line with what you said. 7,000 veterans, 1 in 3 with post-traumatic stress indicators. They're just the ones that we know of.
They're the ones that have actually, when they join our organisation, we send out a little survey to find out how long they'd been in the job, where they were, and then we have a free-fall text for them to provide us as much information as they wish or not. And so they are the ones that have told us that they've experienced that. And often I think I come back to, Brent, the point about that you've lost that sense of purpose and you've lost that identity. So if you have retired from the job or you've been boarded out with ill health, what you find is you have time on your hands. You know, you're no longer getting up and going to a job. And that time is the thing that often makes you start to recall the number of events that you have experienced through the course of your job. And it's like we said earlier, it could be the smallest thing. It could be someone just walking down the street, crossing the road, and all of a sudden they've remembered an incident that they've come in. They don't need to necessarily be involved in another traumatic event for these illnesses to come forward. It can simply be hearing of an event. It can be walking down and having a smell or a sight that comes in front of you that makes you recall, you know, I had 30 incidents that I dealt with that were traumatic across the time of my career.
This role of looking after your veterans in Victoria is always an important role, but we could say no more so than currently, where, you know, all of our heads in Australia collectively have turned to Victoria with the tragic loss of 2 serving officers in regional Victoria. This is an ongoing investigation. We can't speculate anything at all. We can only say that we all lost 2 officers. We're attending a job that any police officer that you could speak to has done that many times we couldn't put a figure on it.
Yeah.
This doesn't make, you know, your role any more or less important than it was 2 weeks ago, but goodness me, it certainly puts the spotlight on this, doesn't it?
It does, Brent. And firstly, I would like to acknowledge Detective Leading Senior Constable Neil Thompson and also Senior Constable Vadim DeWatt. The events of Porpunga have had that ripple effect in our particular organisation, but we actually sit in the Victoria Police Centre in the Welfare Department. And for me, to firstly observe how quickly and succinctly that part of the department in the Victoria Police came together was inspiring. To see them roll out the support that they need to roll out to get up and head into country Victoria to be there to support people. But in our organisation, myself and our social worker last week spent all week ringing our peer support officers, because we wanted to check in that they were okay, but also knowing that they were working with a number of veterans across our organisation. It was important that they knew they had our support and that we were here to provide them with anything that we could do. And I feel a real honour and a privilege to have been able to roll out our own support and our own response to what was a tragic event. And none of us ever think when you're in the police force that you're going to put on that uniform that day and not come home. And so our hearts and thoughts go out not only to Neil and Vadim's family and friends and colleagues, but to the community. And so whilst we have seen an incredibly tragic event that I hope never happens again, at the same time, it's also heartwarming to see the response that we've had from even the community. The community have come out and they've come out in support. They've been delivering flowers and chocolates to local police stations that have no connection to Porpunga, just to say that they're here. At Police Veterans Victoria, we absolutely walk alongside of Victoria Police, and the events of last week were heartbreaking for all of us.
It's tragic incidences, I think, of this nature that bring all of us back to thinking Goodness me, there have been so many reports up here in Sydney in the recent days in the papers, both from ex-police officers, past serving police, but also as poignantly from family members, from husbands, from wives, children, parents who have relatives, who have husbands, wives, children, parents in the police. And it brings you back to that thought that, tomorrow is promised to no one. And there are some of us in these jobs and people serving in these roles who go out the door every day, leaving those families. And this is the selfless service on behalf of all these folks. It's a sad time, but it's also a time where community does band together, don't they?
They do. It's definitely a sad time, Brent, but it also gives you faith in humanity in some regards, because you know that there has been those ripple effects that have gone across the country and, in fact, across the world. We've had posts on the back of our acknowledgement of the loss of these two officers that we put out on social media, and we've heard from other countries and other police forces around the world acknowledging it and saying that their sadness in hearing the events. And that is heartwarming. It's heartwarming to know that you are doing this job because you want to make a difference to the community that you serve. And so an acknowledgement that they've paid the ultimate sacrifice is also quite beautiful, as you say.
Deb, you've had a very storied career since leaving the police. You've worked in a lot of different roles, different levels within corporations and things such as that. You now found yourself almost having come full circle back to the Police Veterans Victoria. I'm going to put my neck out and say this is probably a role that you will cherish almost as much as your time in the job.
Yeah, I think, what am I? I think it's about 9 weeks or 11 weeks or something that I'm in this chair already. I feel in some ways, Brent, that I've come home, and I feel the struggles that I had when I went into the police force first time round, knowing that I absolutely wanted to do that job and doing another 8 years after being blown up in a bomb. This is the role that I'm meant to do, and it's the role that I'm hopefully able to make a difference to our veterans' lives, and I'm really honoured and privileged to be here.
I just want to thank you so much, Deb, for your service to the good people of Victoria during your time in the police and your ongoing service now that you, as you said, have come home to pick up the reins. There could be no more poignant and important time for someone in your role, and I can't think of anyone better to take that position than you. I just want to thank you so much for taking the time out of what is a very busy period of time for you to come and have a chat to us here in the studio.
Thank you, Brent. I really appreciate the opportunity. What I will finish on saying is if you are a member of the community and you're out there today and you're walking past a couple of police officers that happen to be in the street too, go up and thank them for their service too, because it will mean a lot.
My guest was Debra Richardson, CEO of Police Veterans Victoria and a survivor of the Russell Street bombing in 1986. Join us next week for another episode of Crime Insiders Forensics. I'm Brent Sanders, with sound design by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.